Welcome back. It is Bible Scribe, and this is Caesar's Messiah Shredded, Part 5, The Alexanders and Herods. In this section and segment of the video that we're going to go through, and we've been going in parts 1 through 4, step by step through the video, the entire Caesar's Messiah video, and tearing apart every statement. And what we're going to see in this segment is these two Jewish families of rulers in Judea called the Alexanders and the Herods. He's going to bring these guys up along with other people, other Jewish people that had connections to the Roman Empire at that time, and try to make points on how they conspired with the Romans now to create Christianity. And so as we go through, just keep in your mind and realize that at this time, there was this symbiotic relationship in the area of Judea between these rulers who ruled over Judea and Rome, the Roman Caesars and other rulers. And the reason that they existed is because they provided much wealth and taxation to Rome. And then at the same token, Rome would then help these rulers out and give them kickbacks as well. So there was this good symbiotic relationship that had been occurring since the first Caesars, and this was before Christ, BC. And this had been beneficial to both parties and was not, I mean, this is very well attested to in historians and everything, and had nothing to do with a motivation to quell Judaism or create Christianity at all. And again, both the Romans and these Jewish ruling families disliked and fought against the Jewish zealots, who was the group that was causing all the problems and fighting the Roman armies and all this stuff throughout this time period. So just realize that's the backdrop of what's being talked about here. And now let's start going through this section of the video and see what else he says.
To produce and disseminate this literature was a huge undertaking, and the Flavians undoubtedly had collaborators. We know they were funded by the wealthiest family in the world at this time, the Alexanders, a Jewish family who served as Rome's tax collectors in Egypt. Like the Herods in Judea, the Alexanders had strong motivation to keep the Jews' messianic movement from threatening their position and their wealth.
I just realized in their statements that they assume, by what they just said, that their purpose was to rewrite or create Christianity. And so they've already assumed something for which they provided no evidence. And so just realize that they're using the language that they have purposefully written into this video to sway you to think that it's an assumed fact, when they have just skirted over the topic and made statements and assertions but never provided you any evidence in historical writings or documentation. And then we get to this ruling family of a Jewish family called the Alexanders. And they are going to try to make the point that the Alexanders conspired with the Romans to write this Christian religion called Christianity. And so, it just begs some common sense questions. Why would a Jewish family want to work with the Romans and fund the Roman destruction of the Jewish religion in 70 AD? And we're going to find out that they didn't want to do that from the writings of Josephus, which is referenced often by these people in this video. My question here is, did they not instead probably seek the coexistence of Judaism with the Roman rulership? It's what they had had for almost a century. And it's what these rich ruling Jewish families had benefited from, this coexistence with Rome. And it's why they fought against the Jewish zealots who were trying to mess that all up. They were involved in Roman politics, and as we're going to see, they were involved in Roman military. Not particularly, but they would use their military, their their military regimens to help the Caesars. It's because they had a coexistent financial relationship. So there's this guy, Alexander the Alabarch, who we read about in a few different places. It's in Josephus, it's in Suetonius, as I've mentioned here. In his book on Vespasian, chapter 6, verse 2, it says that Alexander's son, Tiberius, commanded his armies to swear allegiance to Vespasian. And this was a military agreement. It's the only connection that we really have mentioned to Vespasian in all these writings. That it was an agreement, live and let live. And then, as far as the Caesars, if they ever called on these Jewish rulers, they expected them to answer. And that was part of this whole symbiotic I scratch your back, you scratch mine relationship that they had. And then Tiberius Alexander was the Roman procurator of Judea between 46 and 48 AD. Just remember these dates, because this time frame is way before the time period of the destruction of the temple, and when Atwill and friends have said and stated that Christianity was created was after or way after all that. But here we are, and the relationships exist way, way long, 30 years before that time period. And so again, following through with this Alexander the Alabarch, who was very, very powerful in Alexandria, Egypt. In Josephus' Antiquities 19.5.1, it says that he had actually been imprisoned by Caius Caligula, the Caesar that was before the Flavians, one of them that was quite a few years before the Flavians, and that Josephus mentions no reason for this. He doesn't state why this happened, but that he also set Alexander Lysimachus, the Alabarch, who is the one we're talking about, at liberty. So Claudius, after Caligula had put him in jail, Claudius set him free. Now it's probably related to this relationship of politics and money, and maybe he had done something that Caligula didn't like, so he put him in jail. And then, next emperor comes along, Claudius, he takes him back out and has a new relationship with him, a new agreement. Oh, well, if you increase your taxes this percentage and give that to me monthly, then we'll look over all this stuff that Caligula said you did. It's that kind of thing that's going on here. It's not any kind of conspiracy. And just notice, we're not able to find any record of any conspiracy or collusion working together to make some religion for the benefit of Rome. No, it's only a military cooperation. And the times that these Jewish leaders and kings come to the aid of the Caesars is when they need help with the Jewish revolt, the zealots that were trying to destroy this relationship. In Josephus, it also says that this Alexander, the Alabarch, had made the gold and silver gates of the Jewish temple. So that shows us that he had a vested interest in the temple itself and the actual practice of Judaism. He was a Jew who had a relationship with Rome, but he also supported his own religion, the religion of Judaism, and the practice of it in the temple in Jerusalem. But he didn't agree with the Jewish zealots who were running around and banding together and then trying to kill Roman soldiers. And most of the Jews didn't agree with those people. In Josephus' Wars 5.5.3, it says, these 9 gates had that silver and gold poured upon them by Alexander, the father of Tiberius. Exactly who we're talking about. That's the evidence. See, I'm giving you evidence for everything I'm saying. Atwill is not giving you evidence for everything he's saying. And so, I want to put a little information about Tiberius Alexander. Alexander the Alabarch's son. He was the Roman procurator, as I said before, of Judea from 46 to 48 AD, and then became the Roman prefect of Egypt. He had this good relationship and could control the Jews and keep peace, so the Romans made him prefect of Egypt from 66 to 69 AD. And then when the Jews revolted in Alexandria, he was able to come to Vespasian's aid and quell the riots with his Jewish armies. It says that He sent among them privately some of the principal men and thereby entreated them to be quiet. So this is Tiberius trying to reason with the Jews not to rise up against Rome because it would mess things up for him. He sent some people privately to some of the principal leaders of the zealots, the Jewish zealots, and thereby entreated them to be quiet and not provoke the Roman army against them. But the seditious made a jest of the entreaties of Tiberius and reproached him for so doing. So they laughed in his face. And this is all recorded in Josephus' Antiquities 2.18.8. These zealots laughed in his face, said, "Forget you, we're going to fight Rome." And so then Tiberius Alexander had to put them down before they ruined his good relationship with the Romans. A relationship of power, of money, and prestige. So why would he jeopardize that by letting these zealots, who he didn't even agree with, destroy that relationship? And that's exactly what's happening here. Again, this is what's evidenced in the writings, and there's zero evidence of Atwill's assertion that these rich, wealthy Jewish families conspired with the Roman Caesars, the Flavian family. Just no evidence. And in Josephus' Wars 6.4.3, Tiberius also participated in an initial decision by Titus not to destroy the temple during the siege of Jerusalem. He wanted to keep the temple and then quench the fire that was starting to burn the temple. Titus said to Alexander and his other leaders in the army, because Alexander had brought his armies in too, that although the Jews should get upon that holy house and fight us thence, we ought not to revenge ourselves on the things that are inanimate, meaning the temple, instead on the men themselves. So Fronto, Alexander, and Cyrillus grew bold upon that declaration and agreed to the opinion of Titus, that they should not destroy the temple. So again, this shows that Tiberius was in support of preserving the Jewish religion and their heritage of the temple and everything about Judaism. He was sympathetic with Judaism, not with Roman pagan ideals or any conspiracy to create a new religion called Christianity. None of that. None of it's evidenced. This is the evidence. I'm showing it to you. So let's continue on.
One of their family members was Philo of Alexandria, a famous Jewish theologian who was already writing works that combined Jewish beliefs with the modern Greek and Roman pagan beliefs of the day. Many scholars agree that his writings form the basis for much of the philosophy of Christianity.
So, Philo of Alexandria. Now, what they say is that Philo's work provided a basis for the philosophy of Christianity. So we're going to look into that. In Josephus' Antiquities 18.8.1, he says Philo was the ambassador between the Alexandrian Jews and the Roman Emperor Caligula in 37 to 41 AD. And if you remember what we just talked about with Alexander, this was about the time that he was put into prison by Caligula. So this was a very kind of troubled time for the Alexandrian Jews in partnership with the Caesars. And this was not the Flavians. This was in 37 to 41 AD. It was way before the Flavians came into power. 20 years, at least. Many of Philo's works were concerned only with the Hebrew scriptures, which he even stated himself in his writings were the source and standard of all truth. So he obviously believed in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Judaistic thought. Philo did. Although he was Greek and Hellenistic in his thinking, he brought a Platonic type of thought to those scriptures because that's how he was raised. He was a Greek, essentially, as far as his upbringing. And he was raised in the Hellenistic Greek culture. So when he examined the Hebrew scriptures, of course, there was Platonic thought used in that interpretation. But this is in no way meaning that he built up a Christian worldview. This was simply the view of the time of the Hebrew Scriptures and had nothing to do with Christianity. Neither did Philo have anything to do with the Flavians. And we're going to see that in just a second.
In these pages is practically every concept that you can find within Christianity. He combined Greek philosophy, and he took that and he combined it with Judaism. On top of that, he was from an extremely wealthy family. And this is important because you have to follow the money when you're looking at major trends, new paradigms being set. And if you look at his family, then you start seeing, well, this is interesting because now we're starting to come across the Flavians again. His relatives were very involved with the Flavians. That whole area is where we want to look very closely for the Christian origins.
So, trying to connect Philo to the Flavians is what she's talking about here. And the fact is, there's no connection, or no evidence of a connection between Philo and the Flavians, as she even had to state as she was rambling there. She had to say, well, his relatives were connected to the Flavians, right? But Philo wasn't. He died in 50 AD. That was way before the Flavians had any sort of power. And he wrote his writings earlier than that, of course, probably in the arena of 20 to 30 AD, or even possibly earlier, when the Flavians were not even a blip on the screen. They were at that time working in the Roman military and political system and were very, very young. Titus and Vespasian were very young at this time, 20s. So they were trying to build a career in the military and the political system of Rome. They didn't have anything to do with Philo because he was the ambassador between Alexandria and the Caesars, which was Caligula and Claudius. And Philo had died way before the Flavians took any positions of power in Rome. There's no evidence of a connection between the Flavians and the Alexander family until Tiberius Alexander, which was Philo's nephew. It was a whole generation after Philo. A whole generation. So again, these timelines do not match, and Atwill and company continue to push this narrative that smashes all the timelines together. And that's how they build this story, but because they never go into the timelines, they don't talk about when things occurred, they don't talk about what the writings actually say about these people, they are always giving you a misreading of these things, and a total wrong understanding. It's the understanding they want you to have, so they build the narrative that culminates in Christianity being created, but there's zero evidence for it. It's a made-up story by them.
From exactly this same circle of people that you get the first signs of Christian ideology, and they all lead to the rise of the Flavian dynasty.
The Christian ideology coming from these people. Well, it didn't come from Philo. He wrote about the Hebrew Scriptures, not Christianity. He venerated the Hebrew Scriptures as the source of truth. And it didn't come from the Flavians. They didn't write anything before this time period. And it didn't come from Josephus. He wrote almost nothing about Christianity. Only 2 lines in thousands that he wrote had anything to do with Christians or Christ. I'll tell you what, the Christian ideology came from the myriad of Christian writings that are dated from the time period between 30 and 70 AD, before the Flavians. That's been the general accepted scholarship for 2,000 years. And to just come on a whim and say, no, wait, we dated all those wrong. We're going to push those all out 50 years so that none of them could have been written before the Flavians came along. It's totally bogus. I mean, it's laughable. I laugh at this. You know, I've laughed at this for a long time until I started realizing people were taking this serious.
Another wealthy, influential character, Princess Bernice, was from the Herod family in Judea. She's the granddaughter of Herod the Great, a product of the Herod's intermarriage with the conquered Jewish ruling messianic lineage.
Now, I just want you to realize what they're starting to try to do, and they've been trying it with these Alexanders, and they're going to mention the Herodians, the Herods, and now they're going to talk about Bernice. And it's because these are all Jews. And so what they've done, what Atwill has done, is scoured the first century historians for any Jews that had any connection to the Romans during this time period. This is how he's building the narrative. He scoured the histories, Suetonius, Tacitus, Josephus, trying to find any connection between Judaism and the Romans. And so every time he found a Jew that was connected, the Herods, the Alexanders, Bernice, he is going to add that into his story as, quote, evidence that they were all colluding with the Romans. But there's no evidence of collusion. There's only evidence they had political and financial relationships. And so the reality is there were all sorts of Jews in this time period who were involved with and taking advantage of the relationship between Judea and the Roman Empire. This was for financial and political gain for the Jews, and that is evidenced. That is evidenced in all the writings. There's financial and political partnerships between the Jewish leadership and the Romans. And we've known this for a long time, forever. This is obvious. Most Jews were not the zealots, not the ones creating the problems, but wanted to live side by side with these partnerships with Rome because it afforded them advantages. There was marketplace advantages. They could sell their wares, especially these Jewish leaders. They got rich while most of the Jewish population was not so rich. And that's part of what created these bands of zealots. They got fed up with it and said, we're taking back our country. But these leaders did not go along with that. They didn't want that.
Princess Bernice appears in the New Testament, which makes her an interesting character. She had 2 or 3 husbands and then became the mistress of Titus. So you can see this again, rather like dynasty here. You know, powerful people, mixed marriages, you know, shacking up with the conqueror. Yeah, and it's really where Joe Atwill takes his idea of a conspiracy to write the New Testament. But let him say it in his own words.
Bernice. Okay, so this is the sister of Herod Agrippa II. He was a king of Judea in the mid-1st century. In Acts chapters 25 and 26, we actually have a connection. This Bernice is mentioned with Agrippa because Paul defends himself before Agrippa and pleads a case so that he won't get put in prison, but he does end up getting put in prison. This Herod Agrippa and Bernice were, by the way, accused of incest by the population. I don't know if it was because of she was always seen with him or whatever, but either rumor had gotten out or someone had seen this happen, but they were accused of incest. She, by the way, was married 3 different times during this time period, and at the last had an affair with Titus, the Flavian emperor Titus, who was 11 years younger than her, by the way. So this is the evidence of what happened with her. That's all it says. So was she plotting with Titus to create Christianity? Or is it more likely she was just screwing everybody in a bid for power? Pardon my French. I suggest it was the latter. She seemed to not have any loyalty to any of her husbands, so she was going after either power or sexual satisfaction. She had all these different relationships and was essentially a mess. I don't think that she had enough of a head on her shoulders to probably do any kind of plot. But Atwill thinks, every Jew that was connected to any emperor or the Flavians or Rome in general was plotting to create Christianity. It's really stupid.
Bernice was a Herod related by marriage to the Alexanders, and of course later she became the mistress to Titus. The fact that she was so closely linked with the Flavians shows you that the three families were very unified in financial, romantic, and likely theological issues.
I like the way they push ideas. He says that this shows you, like, let me tell you what it shows you. It shows you the families were unified in financial, romantic, and likely theological issues. Notice that he uses the word likely there because he can't go outright and say it. He hasn't given you any evidence of a theological connection between these people. Financial connection, yes. We have evidence that the Herods, that Bernice, the Alexanders, they were connected financially to Rome. Yes. Romantic, yes. Bernice was definitely connected romantically to all these people. She was having affairs with all of them. And then theological, there's zero evidence of a theological connection between Bernice and any of these people. Why does Atwill think he can make these unsubstantiated statements and just get away with it? Well, it's because he thinks you won't pick up on it, that you won't do the study. And most people don't do the study. And it's funny that when Paul pleaded his case before Agrippa and Bernice in Acts chapters 25 and 26, Agrippa states that Paul did not persuade him to become a Christian. And this is in 59 AD. And it has been held by scholars since the time of Christ that the book of Acts was written in the mid-1st century, before the Flavians came along with this supposed plot by Atwill. And so scholars have looked at this and said, wow, look, the Bible testifies to the fact that, Paul came before Agrippa and Bernice, and hey, let's look in the Roman histories for that. And sure enough, Agrippa and Bernice were always together. In fact, it was, rumored that they had an incestuous relationship, sexual relationship. So for centuries, we've seen that these things support each other. And it paints a picture of a cohesive history of the 1st century. But then Atwill comes along and says, no, that stuff was all written after the fact and pointed back to something that didn't really happen. Is that really what you think is true? That's ridiculous.
By the looks of things, this coalescence seemed to have brought about a dynamic that led to the synthesis of Judaism and paganism and eventually became Christianity. So this is a very key time period.
So again, just a crazy statement. This led to the synthesis of Judaism and paganism, eventually became Christianity, she says. Where have you explained, tell me, that paganism was combined with Judaism? Is your evidence for that Philo? Because he did not connect Judaism with paganism, only Platonic thought, Platonic philosophical concepts. He didn't connect it with pagan god worship or anything like that. And then you say eventually it became Christianity. Well, the video has stated multiple times that the Flavians created Christianity right after 70 AD. So how much time went by? Since scholars really have generally agreed for centuries that the Christian writings appeared in the mid-1st century before all this, how do you reckon that timeline? You just making things up? You just put things where you want them on the timeline and decide, oh, because I said so, this must be here, that must be there. Babylonian paganism, by the way, had been a part of Judaism for hundreds of years prior to this, since their dispersion into Babylon. But Christian paganism was not introduced into the church until the 4th century. So where do you get off saying that paganism had blended with Judaism in the sense of the Roman paganism? It hadn't. The Jews did not want Roman statues in their synagogues and in their places of worship to God. They were fighting against that. And then it's not until the Catholic Church, the 4th century, that pagan ideas were filtered into Christianity because Constantine merged and syncretized a bunch of pagan religions with Christianity in his empire, the Roman Empire. So this time period we're talking about, these statements can't be made. The timelines don't match.
I believe that the Gospels were actually written under the control of the Herods, the Alexanders, and the Flavians. These families had the motivation to create Christianity, and with the expertise in Judaism that the Alexanders and the Herods had, they had the actual technical ability to come up with these stories that are fulfillment of Hebraic prophecies.
So it seems
He says that the Herods and the Alexanders and Flavians altogether created Christianity. I mean, that's kind of funny because prior to this point in the video, he had said that the Flavians just did it. And now it's a cooperation between all these Jewish rulers in the ruling class and the Roman Flavians. It's also funny how no true evidence has been provided to support this viewpoint yet. Not in the video. And in his book, there's only slim references here and there to these things in the historians of the first century, but you can go pages in that book without getting a reference or a citation with statements like this. Only connections that are really evidenced are financial and military connections between these rulers in Judea and Alexandria and the Romans, or marriages and affairs with their wives. If the Roman Caesar comes into a Jewish province and sees a, hot ruling class woman, even if it's the wife of one of the rulers in Judea, might they just take them, or have a secret relationship? I think that's probably the case. This isn't a conspiracy, it's secret liaisons. These families, the Alexanders, Herods, they were the wealthy, powerful Jews who were trying to cozy up to the ruling class in Rome because of the benefits it afforded them. This is what the evidence shows. It doesn't show anything more than that. It doesn't show any conspiracy. It doesn't show them amassing legions of writers to come up with and write and take down all of their information on this new religion they were creating. You think that might have leaked out if they had, dozens of writers working on this stuff day and night to try to build this religion really quick after 70 AD, but before Josephus got finished with his Wars of the Jews or his Antiquities. So it's crazy to think this actually occurred when there's zero evidence. That is really what I have for this part 5, the Alexanders and Herods. The next section is going to be, I think, on documentation that Atwill goes into. I suppose it's the writings of the first century, that Christian writings that he says were written way after the fact, after the Flavians came up with this conspiracy, but that we've known for centuries were written way before the fact, in the mid-first century, when the Christians were persecuted by people like Nero, which is recorded in Josephus and other historians of the time period, and has been very well attested to. So how were there Christians being persecuted by Nero before the Flavians were able to create Christianity? Does that make sense to you? Join me next time. Like and subscribe and get the alerts so you know when the next part comes out. Thank you.